Police laughed as they cuffed a black teen, but silence fell when he sat as their judge. The laughter cut through the night air like a knife. Officer Brendan Miller's smirk grew wider as he tightened the handcuffs around Marcus Johnson's wrists, the cold metal biting into the 17-year-old's skin. "Guess you won't be making it to that fancy scholarship interview tomorrow," Miller chuckled, exchanging knowing glances with his partner, Officer Paul Davidson. "College material, huh? That's a good one." Marcus kept his eyes downcast, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, I was just walking home from the library. I didn't do anything." Officer Davidson yanked Marcus roughly toward the patrol car. "They all say that, don't they, Miller? Always innocent. Never did nothing." As they pushed Marcus's head down to force him into the backseat, he caught sight of Mrs. Abernathy watching from her porch across the street. The elderly woman who had known him since he was in diapers, who had just last week proudly displayed his acceptance letter to Georgetown on her refrigerator, now stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth in horror. In that moment, something shifted inside Marcus. The humiliation burned in his chest, but beneath it, something else took root. Not hatred, not vengeance, but a quiet, unwavering resolve. "Officer Miller," Marcus said, his voice finding new strength despite the tears threatening to spill. "I want you to remember my face, remember my name, Marcus Johnson, because someday we're going to meet again, and when we do, I promise you'll remember this night differently." Miller laughed again, slamming the car door shut. "Sure thing, kid. I'll be waiting." Neither of them could have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. Neither could have imagined that 15 years later they would indeed meet again in a wood-paneled courtroom where Marcus Johnson would sit not as a defendant, but as his honor, Judge Marcus Johnson. And when that day came, it wouldn't be laughter that filled the air. It would be silence. Part 2. Background setup: Marcus Johnson had always been exceptional, though he'd learned early to wear his brilliance like an invisible cloak. Growing up in Westwood, a neighborhood that the rest of Millfield, Connecticut strategically forgot existed, he developed the careful navigation skills required of young black men in America. His mother, Denise Johnson, had instilled in him both ambition and caution from an early age. "You have to be twice as good to get half as far," she would tell him, her hands still rough from her shift at Millfield General Hospital, where she worked as a nursing assistant. "But don't you ever let that stop you from being great." And Marcus hadn't. By 17, he had maintained a 4 GPA while working part-time at the local grocery store to help his mother with bills. His bedroom wall displayed carefully preserved certificates: debate team captain, National Honor Society, first place in the state science fair. But his most prized possession was the Georgetown acceptance letter that had arrived just 3 weeks earlier, along with the scholarship invitation that could make that dream financially possible. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'm nervous about this interview," Marcus had confessed earlier that very day, helping the 72-year-old widow carry her groceries up her porch steps. Clara Abernathy had been a fixture in Marcus's life since his father had left when he was 5. A retired high school English teacher, she had supplied Marcus with books, encouragement, and occasionally her late husband's tie when Marcus had special presentations at school. "Nonsense," she'd said, her arthritic hands patting his cheek. "Georgetown would be lucky to have you. Just be yourself. That's more than enough." Marcus had smiled, buoyed by her confidence. "I stayed late at the library working on my responses. I want to be prepared for any question they might ask." That's my Marcus, always prepared. She'd handed him a Tupperware container. "Oatmeal cookies for brain food. Now get some rest before your big day." Marcus never made it home with those cookies. On the other side of town, Officer Brendan Miller was having a different kind of day. At 32, Miller had been with the Millfield Police Department for 8 years. His father had been an officer before him, as had his grandfather. Law enforcement was in the Miller blood, along with a certain rigid perspective on how the world worked. Responding to a 211 at the Fairview Mini Mart, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio as Miller and his partner Davidson patrolled the streets. "Copy that," Miller responded, hitting the siren as Davidson made a sharp U-turn. The robbery call would ultimately prove to be unfounded, just a misunderstanding between the store owner and a customer. But it would set in motion the events that would change both Miller's and Marcus's lives forever. Because as they headed back toward the station, cutting through the Westwood neighborhood, Miller spotted a young black male walking alone on Sheffield Avenue, wearing a dark hoodie despite the mild spring weather. "Hold up," Miller said to Davidson. "That looks suspicious." Davidson slowed the patrol car. "Want to check it out?" Miller nodded, already reaching for the door handle. "You know the captain's been pushing for more proactive policing in this area." What Miller didn't say, what he didn't need to say to Davidson, was that proactive policing was understood as code for maintaining a strong presence in neighborhoods like Westwood, for making it clear who was in charge. As they pulled alongside Marcus, who was absorbed in mentally rehearsing his scholarship interview questions, Miller's voice cut through his thoughts. "Police, stop right there and show us your hands." Marcus froze, his heart instantly hammering in his chest. His mother's warnings, "always be polite, never argue, keep your hands visible," flooded his mind. "Good evening, officers," he said carefully, showing his empty palms. "Is something wrong?" Miller and Davidson approached, flashlights directed at Marcus's face, temporarily blinding him. "What are you doing out here this late?" Miller demanded. "I'm just walking home from the library, sir. I live 3 blocks from here on Maple Street." Davidson circled behind Marcus. "Got any ID on you?" "Yes, sir." Marcus slowly reached toward his back pocket. "Don't move," Miller snapped, his hand instantly going to his holster. Marcus froze again. "My wallet is in my back pocket. My school ID and bus pass are inside." "Turn around, hands on the car," Davidson ordered. As Marcus complied, confusion and fear battled within him. "May I ask what this is about, officers? I haven't done anything wrong." "We'll be the judge of that," Miller said, beginning to pat Marcus down with unnecessary roughness. "There was a robbery reported in the area." "A robbery? I've been at the library all evening, sir. You can call and verify." "What's this?" Miller interrupted, pulling the Tupperware container from Marcus's backpack. "Cookies," Marcus answered. "My neighbor made them for me." Miller popped the lid, sniffing the contents. "Sure these aren't laced with something?" "No, sir, they're just oatmeal cookies." Davidson, meanwhile, had pulled out Marcus's wallet, examining his ID. "Marcus Johnson, 17. He rifled through the rest of the contents. "Not much cash for someone who just robbed a store." "Because I didn't rob any store," Marcus insisted, his voice beginning to shake despite his efforts to remain calm. "I was at the library studying for a scholarship interview I have tomorrow morning." Miller laughed, the sound cutting through Marcus like glass. "Right, a scholarship." "It's true," Marcus said. "I got accepted to Georgetown. I can show you the letter, it's in my backpack." "Georgetown?" Davidson echoed with exaggerated incredulity. "Hear that, Miller? We've got a real scholar here." The mockery in his voice made Marcus's cheeks burn with humiliation and the first flickers of anger. He thought of his mother, who worked double shifts to keep food on the table. Of Mrs. Abernathy, who believed in him without reservation. Of all the nights he'd stayed up studying while other kids were out having fun. "My acceptance letter is in the front pocket of my backpack," Marcus said quietly, dignity in every syllable despite the situation. Miller zipped the backpack closed without looking. "Save the stories, kid. We've got reports of gang activity in this area and you match the description." "What description?" Marcus asked. The officers exchanged glances, and Miller's next words confirmed what Marcus already knew. "You know what description." It was at that moment that the situation escalated from humiliating to unjust. Without further explanation, Miller spun Marcus around and pushed him against the patrol car. "You're detaining me? For what?" Marcus asked, his voice rising with disbelief. "Resisting an officer, for starters," Davidson said, though Marcus had been nothing but compliant. "I haven't resisted anything. And now you're raising your voice," Miller added, reaching for his handcuffs. "Maybe a night in juvenile detention will teach you some respect." As the cold metal closed around his wrists, Marcus caught sight of Mrs. Abernathy emerging onto her porch, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. The look of horror on her face mirrored the feeling in Marcus's heart, and that was when the laughter started. As Miller and Davidson joked about Marcus's scholarship claims, as they mocked his future plans while that future potentially slipped away, something fundamental changed in Marcus Johnson. Not far away, another patrol car was making its rounds. Inside, Officer Diane Chen, a 5-year veteran of the force, was training rookie Officer James Wilson. Chen, one of the few women of color in the department, had a reputation for by-the-book policing and community engagement. "You always want to know your beat," Chen was explaining to Wilson as they drove. "Not just the streets, but the people. Build relationships. It makes for better policing." Wilson nodded, taking mental notes. At 25, he joined the force with idealistic notions about protecting and serving. 3 months in, he was already noticing the gap between academy training and street reality. "Like Mrs. Abernathy there," Chen continued, nodding toward a house they were passing. "Retired teacher. Looks out for the neighborhood kids. Makes the best oatmeal cookies you've ever tasted." As they approached the intersection of Sheffield and Elm, Chen slowed the car, her brow furrowing at the sight of the patrol car ahead with its flashing lights. "That's Miller and Davidson," she noted, her tone neutral but her grip tightening almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. Let's check it out. As they pulled up behind the other patrol car, Chen immediately recognized the young man being placed in the backseat. Her stomach dropped. "I know that kid," she said to Wilson. "That's Marcus Johnson, honor student, volunteers at the community center where I do outreach." Wilson glanced at her. "Should we intervene?" Chen hesitated, years of departmental politics and unwritten rules flashing through her mind. "Let me handle this," she finally said, stepping out of the car. "Miller Davidson," she called, approaching them with professional courtesy even as her instincts screamed that something was wrong. "Everything okay here?" Miller straightened up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the interruption. "Just handled a suspicious person call, possible connection to that 211 at Fairview." Chen looked at Marcus, now seated in the back of the patrol car, his expression a mixture of fear, anger, and resignation that she'd seen too many times on too many young faces in this neighborhood. "That's Marcus Johnson," she said evenly. "I know him from the community center. He's a straight-A student, Georgetown-bound, if I'm not mistaken." Davidson snorted. "That's what he claims. Convenient alibi, don't you think?" Chen maintained her professional demeanor. "The 211 at Fairview was anything actually taken. Last I heard, it was a misunderstanding." Miller shrugged. "Still, this one was acting suspicious, and he got confrontational during questioning." From across the street, Mrs. Abernathy had begun making her way over, leaning heavily on her cane. "Officers," the elderly woman called out, her voice wavering but determined. "There's been a mistake. Marcus was with me less than an hour ago. He's been at the library studying for his scholarship interview." Miller looked annoyed at the growing number of witnesses. "Ma'am, please return to your home. This is police business." "Marcus Johnson is my business," Mrs. Abernathy replied firmly. "I've known that boy since he was born. His mother will be frantic if he doesn't come home." Chen seized the opening. "Maybe we should call his mother, verify his story." Miller and Davidson exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The situation was becoming more complicated than the easy stop and frisk they'd anticipated. "Fine," Miller finally said. "Chen, you want to vouch for this kid so badly you deal with him. We've got actual criminals to catch." With poorly concealed irritation, Miller unlocked the patrol car and roughly helped Marcus out. He removed the handcuffs with much less care than he'd used putting them on. "Don't think this is over, kid," he muttered, quiet enough that only Marcus could hear. "Westwood's a small place. We'll be seeing each other again." As Miller and Davidson drove away, Chen approached Marcus, who was rubbing his wrists, his eyes downcast. "Are you okay, Marcus?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am," he answered automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. Chen looked from Marcus to Mrs. Abernathy, then to her rookie partner, who was watching the whole scene with barely disguised concern. "Let me drive you both home," she offered. "And Marcus, about that scholarship interview, I'd be happy to write a letter explaining if you're late tomorrow." Marcus shook his head. "No need, Officer Chen, I won't be late." He straightened his shoulders, something resolute and new in his expression. "And someday I'm going to make sure what happened tonight doesn't happen to anyone else." Officer Chen studied him for a long moment. "I believe you will, Marcus, I truly do." What none of them could have known in that moment was how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how their lives would remain intertwined through the years to come. Part 3. Gradual degradation. The incident with officers Miller and Davidson left an indelible mark on Marcus Johnson. Though he made it to his scholarship interview the next morning, arriving early, in fact, with a borrowed tie and dark circles under his eyes, something fundamental had shifted inside him. "You seem distracted today, Marcus," his mother observed 3 days later as he pushed food around his plate at dinner. "Is it the Georgetown decision? They'd be fools not to give you that scholarship." Marcus set down his fork. "It's not that, Mom." "Then what?" Denise Johnson studied her son, noting the new tightness around his mouth, the wariness that hadn't been there before. "You know you can talk to me about anything." Marcus hesitated. He hadn't told his mother about the incident with the police, partly to spare her worry and partly because a deeper, more troubling truth had settled in his chest. She wouldn't be surprised. The knowledge that such treatment was so expected that it wasn't even worth mentioning, that was almost worse than the incident itself. "I'm just tired," he finally said. "End of senior year, you know how it is." Denise didn't believe him for a second, but she recognized the wall her son had erected. It was the same wall she'd watched other black boys build over the years, cousins, neighbors, students she'd known through church. A necessary fortification against a world that too often saw them as threats first and children second. "Mrs. Abernathy asked about you today," she said instead, changing tactics. "Said she hasn't seen you out helping with her garden like usual." Marcus stared at his plate. "I've been taking a different route home from school." The implications of this simple statement hung in the air between them, A different route. Avoiding certain streets, certain officers, the invisible tax of safety calculations that neither of them needed to articulate. "I see," Denise said quietly. Then reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "Marcus, whatever happened, I need you to remember something. This world will try to change who you are. Don't let it." Marcus met his mother's eyes, seeing in them the strength that had raised him alone, that had worked impossible hours without complaint, that had never stopped believing in possibilities even when life offered little evidence for optimism. "I won't, Mom," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure what version of himself would emerge from the crucible of that night. 2 weeks later, the Georgetown scholarship came through. The Johnson household erupted in celebration, with Denise calling everyone they knew, and Mrs. Abernathy bringing over a special chocolate cake she made only for the most momentous occasions. "I knew it," Mrs. Abernathy declared, hugging Marcus so tightly he could feel her frail bones through her cardigan. "Didn't I tell you? Georgetown is lucky to have you?" But even amidst the joy, Marcus found himself scanning the street whenever a car passed by slowly, tensing at the sight of a police cruiser in his neighborhood. The incident had planted a seed of hypervigilance that would be difficult to uproot. Meanwhile, across town, the aftermath of that night was playing out differently for Officers Miller and Davidson. "Got a complaint filed against you too," Captain Richards said, dropping a folder onto his desk where the two officers sat. "Clara Abernathy claims you profiled and harassed a minor without cause." Miller leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "The Johnson kid, Captain, we had a robbery call. He matched the general description. We were doing our jobs. The robbery that turned out to be a misunderstanding between Mr. Patel and a customer over correct change." Richards raised an eyebrow. Davidson jumped in. "We couldn't have known that at the time, sir. The kid was walking alone at night in a high-crime area. Standard procedure." Captain Richards studied them both. At 57, he'd seen the department through multiple eras of policing. He remembered the heavy-handed tactics of the 80s and 90s, the community policing initiatives of the 2000s, and now the body camera era where every interaction was potentially recorded and scrutinized. "Ms. Abernathy says Officer Chen was there too," Richards noted. "Her account differs somewhat from yours." Miller's jaw tightened. "Chen's got a soft spot for those community center kids, compromises her objectivity." Richards closed the folder. "Well, the kid's mother isn't pressing charges, and without body cam footage, it's your word against theirs." He fixed them both with a hard stare. "But I'm putting a note in your files. And Miller, you're overdue for the Community Relations refresher course. I'm signing you up for next month." Miller nodded stiffly, knowing better than to argue, though the assignment was clearly a punishment disguised as professional development. "Davidson, you're partnering with Chen next week while Wilson does his firearms recertification," Richards continued. "Might do you good to see her approach." After they were dismissed, Miller punched a locker in the empty changing room. "This is bullshit. That kid's going to walk around thinking he won something." Davidson shrugged, less personally invested. "It'll blow over, always does." But for Miller, something had shifted. The complaint, minor as it was in departmental terms, felt like a personal affront. The first blemish on a record he'd kept pristine through 8 years on the force. And he couldn't help but connect it to the Johnson kid's parting words. "I promise you'll remember this night differently." Officer Chen, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own dilemmas. Her intervention had helped Marcus that night, but she knew it was just one incident among many. The systemic issues ran far deeper than any individual officer could address. "You did good with the Johnson situation," her mentor, Sergeant Martinez, told her over coffee one morning, "but you need to be careful playing department politics." Chen stirred her coffee absently. "Is that what I was doing? I thought I was just doing my job." "You know what I mean, Diane," Martinez said gently. "Miller's got friends in high places. His father was Richard's partner back in the day. So I should have just driven by, pretended I didn't recognize a kid I've mentored for 2 years, Martinez sighed. "No, but there are ways to handle these situations without creating enemies. You're good police, Chen. We need officers like you to stick around, rise through the ranks. Can't do that if you burn bridges early." Chen nodded, though the compromise left a bitter taste in her mouth. "I get it. Play the long game." "Exactly," Martinez agreed. "Change comes slowly in departments like ours, too slowly sometimes, but it does come." As summer approached and Marcus prepared for his transition to Georgetown, the incident began to recede somewhat in immediate significance, though its implications continued to shape his worldview and decisions. His original plan to major in economics with an eye toward a business career now felt hollow, disconnected from the justice questions that increasingly occupied his thoughts. During a campus visit, he found himself drawn to a panel discussion on constitutional law that hadn't even been on his itinerary. "The framers left us an imperfect document," the distinguished professor was saying, "but one with the capacity for growth and evolution. The question before each generation is how to bring its practice closer to its promise." Marcus sat transfixed, something clicking into place for him. Later, he would change his intended major to political science, with a focus on pre-law, the first of many ripple effects from that night with officers Miller and Davidson. But the most immediate change came in Marcus's relationship with his community. Rather than pulling away from Westwood in preparation for his departure, he found himself more deeply engaged. "I'm starting a test prep program at the community center," he announced to his mother one evening, "for kids who can't afford those expensive courses." Denise looked up from her nursing textbooks. She'd recently enrolled in an RN program, inspired in part by her son's academic success. "That's wonderful, but where will you find the time?" "Between your grocery store job and getting ready for college." "I'll make time," Marcus said with the quiet determination that had always been his hallmark. "These kids need to see someone from Westwood who made it out, who's going somewhere like Georgetown." What he didn't say was that he needed to transform his lingering anger and humiliation into something constructive. Needed to believe that systems could be changed from within, that education could be a shield as well as a ladder. Officer Chen became an unexpected ally in his community center work, occasionally stopping by in uniform to chat with the kids, working to build the positive police interactions that had been so notably absent in Marcus's own experience. "You're doing good work here," she told him one afternoon, watching as he patiently explained SAT algebra problems to a group of sophomores. "Someone has to," he replied, his tone neutral but not hostile. Chen studied him thoughtfully. "You're still angry about what happened. Wouldn't you be?" The directness of his question caught them both off guard. After a moment's consideration, Chen nodded. "Yes, I would be." The simple acknowledgement, the absence of excuses or deflection, seemed to release some of the tension between them. "What are you going to do with all this, Marcus?" she asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass his tutoring materials, his Georgetown acceptance, his obvious intelligence and drive. Marcus looked at the eager faces of his young students, then back at Officer Chen. "I'm going to change things." "Big ambition," she noted, not unkindly. "Someone has to," he repeated, this time with the ghost of a smile. As Marcus's departure for Georgetown approached, Officer Miller found himself thinking about the Johnson kid with surprising frequency. Not out of remorse, Miller remained convinced he'd done nothing wrong that night, but with a nagging sense of unfinished business. "Heard your favorite delinquent is headed to Georgetown," he commented to Chen in the break room one day, his tone deliberately provocative. Chen didn't rise to the bait. "Marcus Johnson, yes, full scholarship. The department could use more success stories like his in our community outreach materials." Miller snorted. "Right, from wrongfully accused to poster child, that's rich." "No one said wrongfully accused, Miller," Chen replied evenly. "Just unnecessarily escalated. There's a difference." The exchange highlighted the growing division within the Millfield Police Department, between officers like Miller, who saw their role primarily as crime fighters, and those like Chen who emphasized community guardianship. It was a microcosm of the national conversation about policing that was beginning to gain momentum, though few in the department would have predicted how directly they would eventually find themselves at the center of that debate. The week before Marcus left for Georgetown, he found himself face to face with Officer Miller again. Not through any police interaction, but in the mundane setting of Westwood Grocery, where Marcus was finishing his last shift before college. Miller, in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement, came through Marcus's checkout line with a six-pack of beer and a frozen pizza. The recognition was immediate and mutual, tension crackling in the air between them. "That'll be $12.87, Marcus said professionally, not acknowledging their history. Miller studied him as he bagged the items. "Georgetown, huh? Heard you made it after all." Marcus met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir, full scholarship." Something flickered across Miller's face, not quite regret, but perhaps a reassessment. "Good for you, kid. Beat the odds." "Some of them," Marcus replied, handing him his change. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a momentary contact charged with all that remained unspoken between them. As Miller turned to leave, he paused. "Some free advice?" he said, not waiting for Marcus to indicate whether such advice was welcome. "Don't come back here except to visit your mom. Places like Westwood, they have a way of pulling people back in no matter how far they get." Marcus considered this, recognizing in Miller's words a strange kind of concern, however misplaced or condescending it might be. "With all due respect, Officer Miller, that's exactly why I will come back," he said quietly. "Because Westwood deserves better than to be written off by outsiders or by its own children." Miller shook his head slightly, as if Marcus had confirmed some private theory about idealists and lost causes. "Your funeral, kid, but I've seen it 100 times." As Miller walked away, Marcus felt a curious mix of emotions, lingering anger, yes, but also a certain clarity of purpose. Officer Miller represented a perspective that went far beyond one man or one police department, a systemic blindness that could only be corrected from within the very systems that perpetuated it. That night, as Marcus finished packing for Georgetown, he came across the journal Mrs. Abernathy had given him as a graduation present. Opening it to the first blank page, he began to write, "Today I saw Officer Miller again. He still doesn't understand, but someday he will. Someday they all will. This isn't about beating the odds, it's about changing them, for Westwood. For Mom, for kids who look like me who haven't even been born yet. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it. But I know it starts with Georgetown, with law school after that, and then." He paused, pen hovering over the page, the future simultaneously vast with possibility and narrowing with purpose. "And then I'm coming home to change things." Little did Marcus know how prophetic these words would prove to be, or how directly his path would eventually cross again with Officer Brendan Miller's in ways neither of them could possibly anticipate. Part 4. Discovery Phase. Georgetown University transformed Marcus Johnson in ways both expected and surprising. The academic rigor challenged him, yes, but it was the exposure to diverse perspectives and the constant questioning of established systems that truly expanded his worldview. "The law isn't just about statutes and precedents," Professor Alina Hargrove declared in Marcus's constitutional law seminar during his junior year. "It's about the stories we tell ourselves about justice, about who deserves protection and who deserves punishment." Marcus, now 20 years old and growing into a quiet confidence that his freshman self could only have imagined, found himself nodding along. He had discovered a passion for constitutional law that surpassed even his initial interest, drawn to its fundamental questions about power, rights, and the framework of democracy itself. "Johnson," Professor Hargrove called on him. "Brown v. Board established that separate is inherently unequal in education. Has that principle been fully realized in American society?" "No, Professor," Marcus answered without hesitation. "De jure segregation ended, but de facto segregation continues through residential patterns, school funding models, and disciplinary practices that disproportionately impact students of color." "And what's the remedy?" she pressed, fixing him with the penetrating gaze that had made her a legendary figure on campus. Marcus considered this. "The courts provided the principle, but the remedy requires political will, community organizing, and practitioners willing to bridge the gap between law's promise and its practice." Hargrove's lips curved in the faintest smile, high praise from a professor known for her intellectual rigor. "Spoken like someone who might become one of those practitioners, Mr. Johnson." After class, she called him aside. "Your analysis was spot on today. Have you considered applying for the Social Justice Law Clinic next semester? Your perspective would be valuable." "I was planning to," Marcus admitted, "though I'm also looking at summer internships back home in Connecticut." "Both would be excellent experience," Hargrove nodded. "You have a natural aptitude for seeing the connections between legal theory and lived experience. Not all students do." Marcus thanked her, warmed by the recognition. As he walked across campus toward his next class, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Officer Chen stopped by today. Asked about you. Said to tell you Millfield PD starting a civilian review board. Thought you'd want to know." Marcus stared at the message, momentarily transported back to that night 3 years ago. Though the acute sting had faded, the incident had become a foundation stone in the edifice of his ambitions, not a wound to nurse but a catalyst for purpose. He texted back, "Interesting timing. Think it will have any real power?" His mother's response came quickly. "Chen seems to think so. She's been promoted to sergeant. Says department changing slowly." Marcus pocketed his phone, thoughtful. A civilian review board in Millfield would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Perhaps change was possible, even in systems as entrenched as police departments, though experience had taught him to temper idealism with healthy skepticism. That evening in his dorm room, Marcus opened his laptop to research the Millfield Initiative. The local newspaper had a brief article about the review board's formation, a response to growing national conversations about police accountability and several controversial incidents within the department. One name in the article immediately caught his attention. Officer Brendan Miller had been involved in an excessive force complaint just 6 months earlier. The case had been dismissed for insufficient evidence, but the article noted it was Miller's third such complaint in 2 years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Miller was still on the force, still interacting with the community, still potentially creating the same experiences for other young black men that Marcus himself had endured. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his mentor from the Pre-Law Society, Professor James Richardson. "Marcus, sorry for the late call," Richardson said when Marcus answered. "I've got some news you might be interested in. The Connecticut State Attorney's Office just posted summer internships. The deadline's tight, applications due next week, but I think you'd be perfect for it." Marcus's pulse quickened. The state attorney's office would provide invaluable experience for someone considering a career in criminal law. "That sounds incredible, Professor. Can you send me the details?" "Already emailed them," Richardson replied. "One more thing, the internship is based in Hartford, but they rotate interns through regional offices, including Millfield. Thought that might be appealing since it's your hometown." After they hung up, Marcus sat motionless, the convergence of opportunities and past history almost too perfect to be coincidence. A summer internship that could take him back to Millfield, a new civilian review board, and Officer Miller still facing the same allegations that had characterized his interaction with Marcus years ago. It felt like threads of a pattern coming together, though the final image remained unclear. He applied for the internship the next day. Back in Millfield, significant changes were reshaping the police department, though not without resistance. Sergeant Diane Chen had indeed been promoted, part of Captain Richards' effort to diversify the department's leadership. The Civilian Review Board, while limited in its powers, represented a concession to growing community pressure for oversight. "This is feel-good nonsense," Officer Miller complained to Davidson in the locker room after their shift. "Civilians second-guessing split-second decisions they've never had to make." Davidson, now a field training officer responsible for showing rookies the ropes, shrugged. "It's the way things are headed, Miller. Body cams, review boards, transparency's the new buzzword." "Transparency," Miller scoffed. "More like paralysis by analysis. How are we supposed to do our jobs with everyone watching every move?" "Same way we always have," came Sergeant Chen's voice from the doorway. "By following procedure and treating people with respect." Miller's expression soured at her intervention. The professional rivalry between them had only intensified with Chen's promotion, particularly as she'd become an internal advocate for the reform measures Miller so despised. "Easy for you to say from behind a desk," he retorted. "Some of us are still out there dealing with the real Westwood, not the sanitized version in your community outreach pamphlets." Chen's expression remained neutral, though her eyes hardened slightly. "Officer Miller, I'd like to see you in my office before you leave today. We need to discuss your upcoming performance review." As she walked away, Miller slammed his locker shut. "This department's going to hell." Davidson glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Look, I get it, but you need to watch yourself, Brendan. 3 complaints in 2 years, that's not sustainable, even with your dad's connections." Miller waved him off. "The Boyd case was bullshit, and you know it. Kid had something in his waistband." "Turned out to be a phone," Davidson reminded him quietly. "Which I couldn't have known in the moment?" Miller's voice rose in frustration. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone's a Monday morning quarterback now." Davidson finished changing in silence, recognizing the futile cycle of Miller's arguments. The truth, which neither of them articulated, was that policing was changing, and Miller was increasingly out of step with the direction the department was taking under Richards' leadership. In Chen's office later, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Your numbers are down this quarter," Chen noted, reviewing Miller's file. "Fewer stops, fewer arrests." Miller crossed his arms defensively. "Maybe because I'm spending all my time filling out forms explaining every interaction I have." Chen set the file aside. "Or maybe because you're deliberately pulling back to make a point about the new oversight measures." Miller's silence confirmed her suspicion. "Look, Miller," Chen said, her tone softening slightly. "No one's asking you to stop doing your job, but the department is evolving and you need to evolve with it." "Into what?" Miller challenged. "Social workers with badges? Into officers who understand that effectiveness isn't measured solely by arrest statistics," Chen replied evenly. "Community trust matters, procedural justice matters." Miller leaned forward. "You know what else matters? Officer safety, morale. Having the backs of your fellow officers instead of pandering to activist groups." Chen studied him for a long moment. Is that what you think I'm doing? Pandering? What would you call it? I'd call it leading, Chen said simply, and part of leading is recognizing when change is necessary. Tension between them represented more than personal friction. It embodied the fundamental debate occurring within police departments nationwide. Tradition versus reform, warrior mentality versus guardian approach. Captain Richards asked me to give you a heads up, Chen continued after a pause. The state attorney's office is reviewing several cases involving our department, including the Boyd incident. They'll likely want to interview you. Miller's expression darkened. Great, another witch hunt. Or an opportunity to tell your side, Chen countered. They're sending an intern to do the preliminary review of files, expected to start in June. Neither of them could have known that the intern in question would be Marcus Johnson, or how his return to Millfield would catalyze events that would transform the department and their lives irrevocably. Spring semester at Georgetown passed in a blur of finals, internship preparations, and increasingly focused career planning for Marcus. His application to the Connecticut State Attorney's Office had been successful, setting the stage for his return to Millfield for the first time in nearly a year. "Mom, I got the internship," he announced during their weekly video call. "I'll be home for the summer." Denise Johnson's face lit up with joy. "That's wonderful news, and you'll be working right here in Millfield." "Part of the time," Marcus explained. "I'll rotate through offices, but yes, I'll spend at least a month at the Millfield courthouse." "Mrs. Abernathy will be thrilled," his mother said. "She still tells everyone about her Georgetown boy." Marcus smiled at the mention of his elderly neighbor. "How is she doing?" "Slowing down," Denise admitted, "but still sharp as ever. She's been involved with that new civilian review board, if you can believe it." This detail caught Marcus by surprise. "Mrs. Abernathy on the police review board. She says someone needs to represent the institutional memory of the neighborhood," Denise chuckled. "I think she's enjoying having a platform for her opinions." The news added another layer to Marcus's anticipation about returning home. Millfield was clearly not the same place he'd left 3 years ago, at least not entirely. The question was whether the changes were substantive or merely cosmetic. He would begin to find out the answer on a warm June day when he reported for his first day at the Millfield courthouse, dressed in a carefully pressed suit and carrying a briefcase that had been a gift from Professor Hargrove. "Johnson, welcome aboard," Assistant State Attorney Vanessa Morales greeted him, shaking his hand firmly. "We're glad to have you with us this summer." "Thank you for the opportunity," Marcus replied. "I'm looking forward to learning from your team." "Well, we're going to throw you right into the deep end," Morales said with a smile that managed to be both encouraging and challenging. "We're reviewing a series of cases involving the Millfield PD, some complaints, some officer-involved incidents. I need someone to organize and analyze the files before we determine which merit further investigation." Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though internally his pulse quickened. "Of course, I'm happy to help with that." "Good." "You'll be working out of the small office down the hall," Morales continued, leading him through the courthouse. "It's nothing fancy, but it's quiet, which you'll appreciate once you see the volume of paperwork involved." The small office turned out to be little more than a converted storage room, with a desk, computer, and walls lined with filing cabinets. But to Marcus, it represented something profound, his first real step into the justice system as a participant rather than an observer. "These are the case files," Morales indicated several boxes stacked beside the desk. "You'll need to review each one, create a summary of the allegations, identify patterns if they exist, and flag any cases that particularly merit our attention based on the evidence available." Marcus nodded, already surveying the task before him. "What's our timeline?" "I'd like an initial assessment in 3 weeks," Morales replied. "Chief State's Attorney is under pressure to demonstrate that police oversight has teeth, but we can't move forward without solid cases." After Morales left, Marcus sat at the desk and opened the first box. Inside were dozens of complaint files, each representing an incident between Millfield police officers and civilians' allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, procedural violations. Names, dates, locations, the raw materials of human experience reduced to formal documentation. He began methodically sorting the files, creating a system to track officers, complainants, types of incidents, and outcomes. It was tedious work but necessary to identify any patterns that might emerge. By late afternoon, a disturbing picture was beginning to form. Certain officers appeared repeatedly in complaints, Miller's name among the most frequent. Certain neighborhoods, a Westwood prominent among them, were disproportionately represented. And the outcomes followed a predictable pattern. The vast majority of complaints were dismissed for insufficient evidence or classified as within departmental policy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing what he was seeing. It wasn't surprising. Exactly the statistics on police complaint outcomes nationwide told a similar story. But seeing it laid out before him, in his hometown involving officers he had encountered personally, made the abstract suddenly, uncomfortably concrete. He opened another file, this one involving Officer Miller and a traffic stop that had escalated to an arrest for resisting. The complainant was a young black man, 22 years old, who alleged that Miller had pulled him over without cause and become aggressive when questioned. The parallels to Marcus's own experience were unmistakable, though this incident had occurred just 7 months ago. The complaint had been dismissed after investigation by Internal Affairs, citing dash camera footage that failed to substantiate the allegations. Marcus made a note to request the footage, though experience suggested it might conveniently be unavailable or inconclusive. Still, proper due diligence required reviewing all available evidence. He continued working until the courthouse was nearly empty, absorbed in the task and the patterns emerging before him. It was only when the janitor knocked on his door that Marcus realized how late it had grown. "Building's closing soon, sir," the older man informed him. "Need to lock up." "Of course, sorry." Marcus gathered his notes. "I'll head out now." As he walked to his mother's car, borrowed for the summer, Marcus's mind continued turning over what he discovered. It wasn't just about Miller or any individual officer. The files revealed a systemic issue, a pattern of complaints consistently resolved in favor of officers, a lack of meaningful consequences even for repeated allegations, and a clear disparity in how different neighborhoods and demographics experienced policing in Millfield. The question was what to do with this information, how to translate data points into actionable recommendations that might lead to real change. And underlying that professional consideration was a more personal one, how to reconcile his role as an objective analyst with his lived experience as someone who had once been on the other side of those complaint forms. That night, as Marcus sat on his childhood bed reviewing his notes, a text message from an unfamiliar number interrupted his thoughts. "Heard you're back in town and working at the courthouse. Coffee tomorrow? We should talk. SGT." D. Chen *. Marcus stared at the message, wondering how Chen had gotten his number and what exactly she wanted to discuss. After a moment's hesitation, he replied, 5 p.m. at Millfield Coffee House work for you? The response came quickly, "See you there." The next day, as Marcus continued his methodical review of case files, he came across a name that stopped him cold: Clara Abernathy. His elderly neighbor had indeed filed a formal complaint against the Millfield Police Department, specifically against officers Miller and Davidson regarding their treatment of a minor resident of Westwood 3 years earlier. The complaint had been filed retroactively after the establishment of the Civilian Review Board, part of a policy allowing for review of past incidents that might establish patterns of behavior. The minor resident was not named in the public portion of the file, but Marcus knew with absolute certainty that Mrs. Abernathy had filed the complaint on his behalf. What he hadn't known, couldn't have known, was that the complaint had triggered an internal investigation that was still technically open. A note in the file indicated that the investigation had been hampered by insufficient documentation and the significant time elapsed since the alleged incident, but had not been formally closed due to its potential relevance to more recent complaints against the same officers. Marcus felt a complex surge of emotions: gratitude toward Mrs. Abernathy, a renewed sense of the incident's significance, and a strange disorientation at seeing his personal experience transformed into an official case number in a manila folder. When he arrived at the Millfield Coffee House that evening, Sergeant Chen was already waiting at a corner table, dressed in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable alertness of a police officer even off duty. "Marcus," she greeted him warmly as he approached. "It's good to see you. Georgetown has agreed with you." "Thank you for reaching out," he replied, taking the seat opposite her. "Though I'm curious how you knew I was back." Chen smiled slightly. "Small town, word gets around, especially when a hometown success story returns to work at the courthouse reviewing police complaint files." The directness of her statement made it clear this wasn't just a social catch-up. "I'm just an intern," Marcus said carefully. "An intern with access to sensitive department files and a personal history with one of our more controversial officers," Chen noted, no judgment in her tone, merely stating facts. Marcus met her gaze steadily. If you're suggesting I can't be objective, actually, I'm suggesting the opposite, Chen interrupted gently. I think you might be uniquely qualified to understand both sides of this situation. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. The department is at a crossroads, Marcus. We have officers like Miller who resist every attempt at reform, and community members who have lost faith that any real change is possible. We need people who can bridge that gap. And you think I'm one of those people? Marcus couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. I think you could be, Chen replied. You've experienced the worst of our department, yet you've chosen to work within the system rather than against it. That's significant. Marcus considered her words. Mrs. Abernathy filed a complaint about what happened that night. Did you know that? Chen nodded. I was interviewed as part of the investigation. I told them exactly what I saw and heard. The file says the investigation is still open, Marcus noted. Technically, yes, though without additional evidence, it's unlikely to result in any disciplinary action. She hesitated, then added, but it did get added to a pattern analysis involving Officer Miller. That analysis is ongoing. The implication was clear. While Marcus's individual case might not lead to consequences for Miller, it could contribute to a larger case establishing a pattern of problematic behavior. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked directly. Chen leaned forward slightly. Because I want you to know that your experience wasn't dismissed or forgotten. And because I want you to understand that change in institutions like police departments happens incrementally, through persistent pressure from within and without. She paused, then continued with careful precision. The state attorney's review of our department is an opportunity for that kind of pressure, if the right cases are identified and pursued. Marcus studied her, understanding the delicate line Chen was walking. As a sergeant, she had responsibilities to her department. But she was also clearly signaling her support for meaningful accountability. I'll keep that in mind, he said finally. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Chen offered a final thought. You know, when you told me years ago that you were going to change things, I believed you. I still do. Marcus watched her walk away, processing the unexpected alliance she seemed to be offering. It was a reminder that institutions weren't monoliths. They were collections of individuals with different perspectives, different values, different visions of what their work should be. The next day, Marcus made a decision. After finishing his scheduled hours at the courthouse, he drove to Mrs. Abernathy's house, feeling a long-overdue conversation was necessary. The elderly woman answered her door with a cry of delight. Marcus Johnson, look at you, all grown up and Georgetown educated. Hi, Mrs. Abernathy, he smiled, accepting her embrace. I hope I'm not interrupting. Nonsense, come in, I'll make tea. She ushered him inside, her home exactly as he remembered it, floral-patterned furniture, walls lined with bookshelves, the subtle scent of lavender and old books. As they settled in her living room with tea and cookies, Marcus gathered his courage. Mrs. Abernathy, I found your complaint about what happened that night with Officers Miller and Davidson. The elderly woman's expression grew serious, the warmth replaced by a dignified resolve. Yes, when they formed that civilian board, I knew it was time. Some things shouldn't be allowed to fade away without a reckoning. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus asked gently. Mrs. Abernathy set down her teacup. Because you were doing so well at Georgetown, because I didn't want to pull you back into something painful when you were building your future. She paused. And because I know how proud you are. You wouldn't have wanted me fighting your battles. It wasn't just my battle, Marcus said quietly. What happened to me has happened to others, is still happening. Exactly, she nodded firmly. That's why I filed the complaint, not just for you, but for all the other young people who don't have someone watching from their porch when it happens to them. The conversation shifted to Mrs. Abernathy's involvement with the Civilian Review Board, her perspective on changes in the community, and eventually to Marcus's work at the state attorney's office. They carefully avoided discussing specific cases he was reviewing, but the underlying purpose of his work hung between them, acknowledged without elaboration. As Marcus prepared to leave, Mrs. Abernathy took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her age. Marcus, she said, her eyes intent on his. Whatever you're doing with those files at the courthouse, do it right, do it thoroughly. Some stories need to be told, even when the system doesn't want to hear them. I will, he promised. That's why I'm here. The next week brought a significant development in Marcus's review. Among the case files was a citizen's cell phone video of an arrest involving Officer Miller, footage that contradicted Miller's official account of the incident in several key respects. The video showed Miller escalating a routine stop into a physical confrontation without clear provocation, then reporting that the civilian had been the aggressor. Marcus watched the video multiple times, documenting each discrepancy with Miller's written report. The evidence was unambiguous. Miller had not just used excessive force, but had falsified official reports to justify his actions. With this discovery, Marcus faced his first major ethical test of the internship. Protocol dictated that he should simply flag the case in his summary report to Assistant State Attorney Morales. But the implications went beyond one isolated incident. This video provided potential corroboration for numerous other complaints against Miller, where it had been the officer's word against civilians. After careful consideration, Marcus drafted a special memorandum detailing not just this case, but the pattern of similar complaints against Miller, including the statistical analysis showing the disproportionate number of incidents involving minority residents of Westwood and other predominantly black neighborhoods. When he submitted the memo to Morales, her reaction was immediate and serious. "This is thorough work, Johnson," she said, reviewing his findings in her office. "And if your analysis is correct, we have a significant problem with this officer. The video evidence in the Rodriguez case is particularly compelling," Marcus noted professionally. "It directly contradicts Officer Miller's sworn statement." Morales nodded, her expression grim. "Falsifying police reports is a serious offense. If substantiated, it could result in criminal charges, not just departmental discipline. There's also the pattern to consider," Marcus added. "The statistical probability of these complaints occurring randomly without underlying misconduct is extremely low." "I agree," Morales said. "I'm going to take this directly to the chief state's attorney. We'll likely convene a special investigative team to pursue this further." She fixed Marcus with a penetrating look. "You should be prepared to present your analysis to them." As Marcus left her office, the magnitude of what had just been set in motion began to sink in. His research could lead to criminal charges against Officer Miller, the same man who had handcuffed and humiliated him years earlier, whose actions had helped shape the trajectory of Marcus's life. It was a watershed moment, one that would have far-reaching consequences not just for Miller, but for the entire Millfield Police Department. And for Marcus Johnson, it represented a profound intersection of personal history and professional responsibility, a test of his commitment to justice as a principle rather than justice as retribution. What he couldn't have anticipated was that this discovery would be just the beginning of a much larger and more complex unraveling, one that would eventually lead him back to that fateful night, but from an entirely different vantage point. Part 5. Set up the special investigation into Officer Brendan Miller moved with surprising swiftness following Marcus's discovery. Within 2 weeks, the chief state's attorney had assembled a dedicated team to pursue the case, with Assistant State Attorney Morales leading the effort and Marcus assigned to assist with case preparation. "We're not just looking at the Rodriguez video incident now," Morales explained during a strategy meeting. "We've opened a comprehensive investigation into all of Miller's arrests over the past 5 years, focusing on potential pattern and practice violations." For Marcus, the experience was both professionally exhilarating and personally complicated. He maintained strict professional boundaries, never revealing his prior history with Miller to anyone but Sergeant Chen. His work remained meticulous, objective, and focused on the evidence, which, as it turned out, was damning enough without any personal bias. As the investigation progressed, Marcus found himself working long hours in his courthouse office, analyzing body camera footage, comparing incident reports with witness statements, and building a comprehensive timeline of Miller's increasingly problematic behavior. "The pattern is clear," he noted in a presentation to the investigative team. "Officer Miller's use of force incidents and civilian complaints have escalated significantly over the past 3 years, with a marked increase following the department's implementation of the Civilian Review Board and new oversight measures." What emerged was a picture not just of individual misconduct, but of an officer who appeared to be actively rebelling against reform efforts, becoming more aggressive and less accountable precisely as the department attempted to increase transparency and community trust. The investigation had not gone unnoticed within the Millfield Police Department. Though officially confidential, the unusual activity at the courthouse and the special attention being paid to Miller's cases had created a ripple of tension throughout the force. "They're coming after me," Miller told Davidson in a low voice as they changed after shift one evening. "State Attorney's Office has pulled every arrest report I've filed in the last 5 years. Davidson's expression was troubled. "Have they contacted you directly?" "Not yet," Miller replied. but it's only a matter of time. Richards called me in yesterday, said they're conducting a review of my cases. Maybe it's routine, Davidson suggested without conviction. Miller slammed his locker shut. Bullshit, Chen's behind this. She's been gunning for me ever since that damn civilian board started. You don't know that, Davidson cautioned. Could be coming from higher up. It's all connected, Miller insisted, a note of paranoia entering his voice. The politicians, the activists, the brass trying to cover their asses, they need scapegoats to show they're addressing systemic issues. And guess who makes a perfect target? Cops like me who are still willing to do the job the way it needs to be done. Davidson studied his longtime partner, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension radiating from him. Brendan, he said carefully, maybe you should take some time off, just until this blows over. Miller's laugh was harsh. Take time off. Give them more ammunition to say I'm hiding something. He shook his head. No, I'm going to keep doing my job. Let them try to prove I did anything wrong. What Miller couldn't know, what no one in the department yet realized, was that the investigation had already uncovered substantial evidence of misconduct, including multiple instances of falsified reports, excessive force, and potentially racist application of police discretion. Most damning of all was the emerging evidence that Captain Richards and several other superior officers had been aware of complaints against Miller, but had systematically minimized or buried them, often citing Miller's family connections within the department and his father's long-standing relationship with Richards. As these deeper institutional issues came to light, the scope of the investigation expanded. What had begun as an inquiry into one officer's conduct was evolving into a broader examination of supervisory failures and potential corruption within the Millfield Police Department's command structure. For Marcus, this widening focus brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it confirmed his growing understanding that individual misconduct rarely existed in a vacuum. It was enabled and protected by systems designed to prioritize institutional preservation over accountability. On the other hand, it meant that the investigation's impact would extend far beyond Officer Miller to potentially reshape the entire department. Johnson, I need you to prepare a briefing on the supervisory issues we've identified, Morales directed during their daily check-in. Focus on Captain Richards' handling of prior complaints against Miller. We need to understand the full extent of the command staff's involvement. Marcus nodded, already mentally organizing the evidence they'd uncovered. Do you want me to include Sergeant Chen's statements in that analysis? She seems to have been one of the few supervisors who actually attempted to address Miller's behavior. Yes, include everything, Morales confirmed. We need to identify not just where the system failed, but also where it worked, where there were opportunities for intervention that weren't taken. As Marcus delved deeper into this aspect of the investigation, a complex picture emerged of a department divided between old guard and reformers, with Sergeant Chen often caught in the middle, trying to push for accountability while navigating the political realities of a hierarchical institution. One evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave the courthouse after another long day, he was surprised to find Captain Richards waiting near his office door. Mr. Johnson, Richards said, his tone carefully neutral. Do you have a moment? Marcus's guard immediately went up. There was no legitimate reason for the captain of the police department to be seeking a private conversation with an intern investigating his officers. I'm actually on my way out, Captain, Marcus replied evenly. If you have questions about the state attorney's investigation, you should direct them to ASA Morales. Richards stepped closer, lowering his voice. This isn't about the investigation, it's about you. Marcus stiffened. Excuse me? 3 years ago, Sheffield Avenue, Officers Miller and Davidson, a young man in a hoodie walking home from the library. Richards held Marcus's gaze steadily. That was you, wasn't it? The direct reference to that night, from someone who shouldn't have known Marcus's identity from the complaint file, sent a cold shock through him. Somehow, Richards had connected the dots. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Captain, Marcus said carefully. But again, any questions about the investigation should go through proper channels. Richards didn't press further, but his message was clear. He knew who Marcus was and was implicitly questioning his objectivity in the investigation. Just remember, Mr. Johnson, everyone has their own perspective on events. Things aren't always as clear-cut as they might seem years later. With that, Richards departed, leaving Marcus shaken but resolute. The encounter only reinforced the importance of maintaining absolute professionalism and objectivity in his work. If the investigation could be tainted by suggestions of personal vendetta, years of potential misconduct might go unaddressed. The next morning, Marcus reported the interaction to Morales, who took it extremely seriously. "That's witness intimidation," she said, anger evident in her voice. "He came to your workplace to imply that your personal history should affect your professional judgment. He was careful not to make direct threats," Marcus noted. "But the message was clear." Morales's expression hardened. "This just became part of the investigation, too. Richards has now demonstrated consciousness of guilt by attempting to undermine our investigator." She paused, considering Marcus thoughtfully. "That said, we do need to address the potential conflict of interest this creates. Not because I question your objectivity, your work has been exemplary, but because defense counsel certainly will if this goes to trial." Marcus nodded, understanding the legal realities. "What do you suggest?" "I'm going to have another member of the team independently verify all your findings," Morales decided. "And you'll need to formally disclose your prior interaction with Officer Miller. It doesn't disqualify your work. It might even strengthen the credibility of our pattern analysis. But it needs to be documented." The disclosure process was straightforward, but emotionally complex for Marcus. Revisiting that night in formal, legal language, transforming a deeply personal experience into an official statement, required a kind of compartmentalization that tested his professional boundaries. Yet there was also something cathartic about the process. For years, that night had lived in Marcus's memory as a private injustice known to a few witnesses, but never officially acknowledged. Now it would become part of a legal record, one piece in a larger pattern of behavior that would finally face institutional scrutiny. As June turned to July, the investigation continued to gather momentum. Additional witnesses came forward after news of the inquiry became public, including several former Millfield residents who had moved away following negative interactions with the police department. Among them was Darius Boyd, the young man whose excessive force complaint against Miller had been dismissed the previous year. Boyd's case had particular resonance with Marcus, given the similarities to his own experience. "He pulled me over for a broken tail light," Boyd explained during his interview, which Marcus was permitted to observe. "But as soon as he saw me, young black man in a nice car, his whole attitude changed. Started asking where I got the car, if I had drugs or weapons." Boyd described how Miller had ordered him out of the vehicle without explanation, then became aggressive when Boyd asked why he needed to exit for a taillight violation. "He said I had something in my waistband. It was my phone. I was recording the stop like my dad always told me to do. Next thing I know, he's yanking me out of the car, throwing me on the ground. Kept shouting, 'Stop resisting,' even though I wasn't fighting back at all." The dash camera footage of the incident, which Marcus had already reviewed, showed clear discrepancies with Miller's report, particularly the officer's claim that Boyd had taken a threatening stance and reached toward his waistband in an aggressive manner before being restrained. "Did you file a complaint immediately?" Morales asked Boyd. "Yes, ma'am, went straight to the station that night, had the bruises and everything." Boyd's expression darkened. "They took my statement, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. 2 weeks later, got a letter saying the investigation found insufficient evidence of excessive force. Said the dash cam supported the officer's version." "Were you given access to that dash cam footage?" Morales pressed. "No. They said I could file a formal request, but it would take time to process." Boyd shook his head. "By then, I was just done with the whole thing. Felt like I was shouting into a void, you know?" Marcus knew exactly what Boyd meant. Had Mrs. Abernathy not filed a complaint on his behalf years later, his own experience might have similarly vanished into the bureaucratic ether. As Boyd's interview concluded, Morales turned to Marcus. "Your thoughts?" "His account is consistent with the dash cam footage we have," Marcus noted professionally. "And it fits the pattern we've been documenting. Miller escalates routine encounters, particularly with young men of color, then justifies his actions with reports that mischaracterize civilian behavior." Morales nodded. "The question is whether we can prove intent and pattern beyond reasonable doubt. 1 or 2 incidents could be dismissed as mistakes or misperceptions. But when the same mistakes happen repeatedly, following the same demographic pattern, it stops being coincidence and starts looking like policy," Marcus finished. The investigation was approaching a critical juncture. With substantial evidence compiled, the chief state's attorney would soon need to decide whether to pursue criminal charges against Miller and potentially other members of the department. For Marcus, whose internship was scheduled to conclude in mid-August, the timeline created a sense of urgency. He had invested too much in this case to leave before seeing it through to some form of resolution. One evening in late July, As Marcus worked late organizing evidence for the final investigative report, he received an unexpected visitor. Officer Paul Davidson appeared in his office doorway, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the courthouse setting. "Johnson," Davidson said by way of greeting. "Got a minute?" Marcus regarded him warily, immediately on guard after the earlier interaction with Captain Richards. "Officer Davidson, what can I help you with?" Davidson glanced down the hallway nervously before stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. "This isn't official. I'm not here as a cop right now." "Then why are you here?" Marcus asked directly. Davidson took a deep breath. "Because this investigation is going to tear the department apart, and I need to know if that's really what you want." The implication that Marcus was somehow orchestrating the investigation for personal reasons sparked a flash of anger. "The investigation is following the evidence, Officer Davidson. My personal preferences aren't relevant." "Come on," Davidson challenged. "We both know this started with you. You're the one who found that Rodriguez video, who put together the pattern report. And now I hear you were involved in an incident with Miller years ago." Marcus maintained his professional composure. "Any prior interactions I've had with the department have been properly disclosed to the investigative team, and every finding in my reports has been independently verified by other investigators." Davidson ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly tired. "Look, I'm not here to threaten you or intimidate you. He paused. "Miller's a good cop who's lost his way. He's under pressure making bad decisions. But does he deserve to have his whole career, his whole life destroyed?" The question hung in the air between them, complex and loaded. "Officer Davidson," Marcus said carefully, "this isn't about punishment, it's about accountability. If the evidence shows Officer Miller has violated the law and his oath of office, there need to be consequences, not just for him, but for a system that enabled his behavior." Davidson studied Marcus with new intensity. "You really believe that, don't you? That this is about the system, not personal payback?" "I do," Marcus replied simply. "Because if it were about payback, I wouldn't care about making the department better. I just want to see Officer Miller suffer, and that's not what drives me." Something in Davidson's expression shifted, not quite acceptance, but perhaps a grudging recognition of Marcus's sincerity. "You should know," Davidson said after a moment. "Miller's not doing well. This investigation, the suspension, the rumors, it's taking a toll. He's drinking too much, talking crazy sometimes." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to this personal revelation. "I'm sorry to hear that, but it doesn't change the facts of the investigation." "No, I guess it doesn't," Davidson conceded. Then almost reluctantly, "For what it's worth, I've thought about that night. With you, we handled it wrong." The admission, so simple yet so unexpected, momentarily left Marcus without words. "Thank you for saying that," he finally managed. Davidson nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Whatever happens with this investigation, whatever happens to Miller or Richards or any of us, the department does need to change. I see that now. Maybe too late, but I see it." After Davidson left, Marcus sat motionless at his desk, processing the strange encounter. It was the first acknowledgement from either officer involved that night that they had done something wrong. A small measure of vindication after years of carrying the weight of that injustice. But more significantly, it reinforced Marcus's growing understanding of the complexities of institutional change. Davidson wasn't a villain, he was a product of a system, capable of recognition and potentially even growth when confronted with the consequences of his actions. The next morning brought a major development. Based on the investigation's findings, the chief state's attorney had decided to pursue criminal charges against Officer Miller for falsifying official reports, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations. Captain Richards would also face charges related to supervisory negligence and obstruction of justice. The news sent shockwaves through Millfield. By afternoon, local media had gathered outside the police department, where an official statement was expected. The courthouse, too, was abuzz with activity as prosecutors prepared the necessary legal filings. For Marcus, the moment was surreal. What had begun with his meticulous review of complaint files had escalated into one of the most significant police accountability cases in Connecticut's recent history. "Johnson," Morales called him into her office amid the controlled chaos. "Great work on this case. The chief state's attorney specifically commended your analysis in the decision meeting." "Thank you," Marcus replied, still processing the magnitude of what was unfolding. "What happens now? We'll file charges tomorrow morning. Miller and Richards will be summoned for arraignment next week." Morales studied him with a mixture of professional appreciation and concern. "How are you handling all this, given your personal connection?" Marcus considered the question carefully. It's complicated, he admitted, but I'm committed to seeing this through based on the evidence, not emotion. Good, Morales nodded, because I'd like you to stay on through August to help with the preliminary hearing preparation even though your internship officially ends next week. Would that work with your Georgetown schedule? Yes, Marcus agreed without hesitation. I'd like to see this case through as far as I can. That evening, Marcus drove to his mother's house, knowing she would have heard the news and would be concerned about his involvement. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Mrs. Abernathy sitting on her porch across the street. After greeting his mother and briefly explaining his extended role in the case, Marcus walked over to Mrs. Abernathy's house. "You've been busy," the elderly woman observed as he climbed her porch steps. "You could say that." Marcus smiled faintly, taking a seat beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fireflies begin to appear in the summer twilight. "Are you okay with all this?" Mrs. Abernathy finally asked. "It's a lot of weight for young shoulders." Marcus considered the question. "I think I am. It's not how I expected my summer internship to go, but it feels necessary." "Necessary," she repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose it is. Some reckonings can't be postponed indefinitely." She patted his hand. "I'm proud of you, Marcus, for doing this the right way, through the system, with integrity." "I learned that from you," he told her. "Filing that complaint when the review board was created, that was the first step, really." Mrs. Abernathy smiled. "Well, some of us old folks still believe in the long arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. It just needs a little help bending sometimes." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car accelerating too quickly down the quiet residential street. Marcus turned to look just as a vehicle swerved erratically before continuing out of sight. "That looked like Officer Miller's personal car," Mrs. Abernathy noted with concern. "Driving much too fast for this neighborhood." The observation sent a chill through Marcus. Davidson's words about Miller not doing well and talking crazy took on new significance in light of the pending criminal charges. "Mrs. Abernathy, I should go," he said, rising quickly. "Just stay inside tonight, okay? And call me if you see that car again." He hurried back to his mother's house, a sense of foreboding building. As he reached the front door, his phone rang, Sergeant Chen calling. "Marcus," her voice was tense when he answered. "Have you seen Miller today?" "No, but his car just drove past my mother's house," Marcus replied, the coincidence too disturbing to ignore. "Why?" "He didn't report for his suspension processing this afternoon. Davidson says he's been making concerning statements about setting things right and exposing the conspiracy against him. We're trying to locate him now." The implications were clear and troubling. Miller was unstable, possibly intoxicated, and had just driven past the home of a key figure in the investigation against him. "I'm at my mother's house on Maple Street," Marcus told Chen. "Mrs. Abernathy is across the street. Can you send a patrol car?" "Already dispatching one," Chen assured him. "Stay inside, doors locked. Call 911 if you see him again." As Marcus hung up, the pieces began to align with disturbing clarity. Miller, facing the destruction of his career and possible criminal conviction, had reached a breaking point. And Marcus, the intern whose work had helped build the case, the young man Miller had wrongfully detained years earlier, represented both the cause and the face of his downfall. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them could have anticipated when they first crossed paths on Sheffield Avenue 3 years ago. But this time, the power dynamics would be fundamentally different, and the stakes exponentially higher. Part 6. Climactic reversal. The patrol car arrived within minutes, parking discreetly at the end of Maple Street rather than directly in front of either the Johnson or Abernathy homes. Marcus watched from the living room window as two officers, neither familiar to him, began a subtle surveillance of the area. "Mom, I need you to stay away from the windows," Marcus instructed, drawing the curtains closed. "And keep your phone close." Denise Johnson, who had absorbed the situation with the calm efficiency of a veteran healthcare worker, nodded. "Should we call Mrs. Abernathy? Make sure she's locked her doors." Sergeant Chen said they were sending someone to check on her, Marcus replied, though worry for his elderly neighbor gnawed at him. "But maybe text her just to be sure." As Denise composed a message to Mrs. Abernathy, Marcus's phone rang again, Assistant State Attorney Morales this time. "Johnson, where are you?" she asked without preamble when he answered. "At my mother's house. Sergeant Chen has officers watching the street." "Good." Morales's voice was tight with concern. "I've just been briefed on the Miller situation. We're treating this as a potential threat to a member of the investigative team. I've requested additional security measures." "Do you think he'd actually try something?" Marcus asked, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. "I don't know," Morales admitted. But his behavior has become increasingly erratic, and with charges imminent, we can't take chances. After they hung up, Marcus paced the living room, the professional detachment he'd maintained throughout the investigation giving way to a more visceral awareness of personal danger. Officer Miller knew where he lived, had driven past the house already, and based on both Davidson's and Chen's accounts, was unraveling under the pressure of the investigation and impending charges. "Mom," Marcus said after a moment's deliberation, "I think you should go stay with Aunt Louise tonight, just to be safe." Denise fixed him with a steady look. "And leave you here alone? Absolutely not." "I'll be fine. There are officers outside." "Marcus Johnson," his mother interrupted firmly. "I did not raise you for 17 years by myself, work double shifts, and put you through college to abandon you when some unstable police officer might be targeting you. We're staying right here together." Her determination was so absolute that Marcus didn't bother arguing further. Instead, he checked that all doors and windows were secured, then settled into the uncomfortable vigilance of waiting. Hours passed without incident. Night deepened around the quiet suburban street, the patrol car maintaining its position, occasionally circling the block before returning to its post. By midnight, the initial spike of adrenaline had given way to a persistent, low-grade tension. Marcus had just suggested his mother try to get some sleep when his phone lit up with a text from Mrs. Abernathy. "Someone's at my back door. Police checking." Before he could respond, the night was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from across the street, followed by the squeal of tires as the patrol car raced toward Mrs. Abernathy's house. "Stay here," Marcus ordered his mother, already moving toward the door. "Marcus, wait." Denise called after him, but he was already running across the street, heart hammering against his ribs. As he approached Mrs. Abernathy's house, he could see the patrol officers with flashlights at the rear of the property. The back door stood open, glass from its window scattered across the porch. "Mrs. Abernathy," Marcus called, rushing up the front steps. "In here, Marcus," came her shaky voice from the living room. "I'm all right." He found her sitting in her armchair, visibly shaken but unharmed, clutching her cell phone. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside her. "Someone was trying to get in the back door," she explained, her voice steadier than her hands. "I heard glass breaking and called 911. Before she could continue, one of the patrol officers appeared in the living room doorway. "Ma'am, sir, are you both okay?" the officer asked, radio crackling at his shoulder. "Yes," Mrs. Abernathy confirmed. "Did you find who it was?" "No, ma'am. They were gone before we reached the back of the house, but we found this." He held up an evidence bag containing what looked like a police badge. "It was on your back porch." Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "Is it Officer Miller's?" The patrol officer hesitated. "We can't confirm that yet, but given the circumstances." His radio interrupted with an urgent message. Another unit had spotted a vehicle matching Miller's car description 2 blocks away, headed toward the center of town. "I need to go assist," the officer explained. "My partner will stay with you until additional units arrive." As the officer departed, Marcus's phone rang Sergeant Chen again. "Marcus, where are you?" she demanded when he answered. "At Mrs. Abernathy's house." "Someone broke her back window. I know, I just got the report," Chen cut in. "Listen carefully. We've located Miller's car near the courthouse. I need you to stay exactly where you are until I send officers to escort you." "The courthouse?" Marcus repeated, confused. "Why would he go there?" "We don't know yet," Chen replied, her voice tight with urgency. "But he's armed and clearly unstable. Just stay put." After hanging up, Marcus relayed the information to Mrs. Abernathy and the remaining patrol officer. His mind raced, trying to make sense of Miller's actions. Why break Mrs. Abernathy's window only to flee? Why head to the courthouse in the middle of the night? "He's unraveling," Mrs. Abernathy said quietly, seeming to read his thoughts. "Men like that, when their authority is threatened, when they're finally held accountable, they don't know how to process it." Marcus nodded, seeing the truth in her assessment. Miller's entire identity was built around his badge, his authority, his place in the police hierarchy. The investigation had stripped that away, revealing the misconduct beneath the uniform. 30 minutes later, additional officers arrived to secure Mrs. Abernathy's house. Among them was Officer Davidson, looking haggard and deeply troubled. "Johnson," he acknowledged Marcus with a terse nod. "Chen sent me to bring you to the courthouse." "The courthouse?" Marcus questioned. "Why would I go there if Miller's in the area?" Davidson's expression was grave. "Because he's asking for you, says he'll only surrender to the Georgetown kid who's trying to destroy his life." The revelation landed like a physical blow. "He's taken hostages." "No," Davidson shook his head. He's alone in the building as far as we can tell, broke in through a service entrance, but he's barricaded himself in one of the courtrooms and he's demanding to speak with you." "That's not happening," the other officer interjected firmly. "We don't send civilians into hostage situations, especially not the civilian the subject has a grievance against." "It's not a hostage situation," Davidson insisted, "and we have snipers positioned with clear sight lines if he becomes an imminent threat. But right now, he's just a disturbed officer having a breakdown, if Johnson can talk him down." "Absolutely not," Mrs. Abernathy declared, finding her voice. "Marcus, you are not going anywhere near that man." Marcus stood silent, weighing the impossible situation. Officer Miller was dangerous, unstable, and fixated on him, yet if there was a chance to resolve this without bloodshed. "What does Sergeant Chen say?" he finally asked Davidson. "She doesn't like it," Davidson admitted. "But Miller's not responding to negotiators. He's becoming more agitated, making threats about exposing the truth and going out with a bang." "Chen thinks he might listen to you." Marcus took a deep breath, decision crystallizing. "I'll go, but I want to speak with Sergeant Chen directly first, and I want guarantees about security measures." Mrs. Abernathy and the patrol officer both protested, but Marcus's determination was set. 20 minutes later, after a tense phone conversation with Chen and emotional goodbyes to his mother and Mrs. Abernathy, he was in a police cruiser headed toward the courthouse. "Why me?" asked Davidson, who drove in tense silence. "Why does he want to talk to me specifically?" Davidson kept his eyes on the road. "Because you represent everything he's losing, his job, his reputation, his freedom. In his mind, you're the face of it all." "But it wasn't personal," Marcus insisted. "The investigation followed the evidence." "Maybe for you," Davidson conceded. "But for Miller, it's all personal, always has been. That's part of his problem. He can't separate the badge from the man." As they approached the courthouse, Marcus could see the massive police response, SWAT vehicles, multiple patrol cars, and ambulance standing by. The building was dark except for lights in one section of the second floor. Sergeant Chen met them at the command post set up across the street, her face drawn with tension. "Marcus, I need to be absolutely clear," she said after briefly explaining the situation. "You do not have to do this. We can wait him out, continue negotiation attempts, find another way." "What's his mental state?" Marcus asked, trying to assess the risk. "Unstable," Chen replied honestly. "He's alternating between rage, paranoia, and moments of disturbing calm. He's fixated on the idea that there's a conspiracy against him, that you're somehow the mastermind of it all." "Does he have demands besides talking to me?" Chen hesitated. "He wants the investigation dropped, wants his badge back. Wants public acknowledgement that he was framed." She paused. "None of which is going to happen. So what's the plan if I agree to speak with him?" "You'll be wearing a bulletproof vest," Chen explained. "You'll have a concealed communication device so you can hear our tactical team. You'll enter the courtroom alone, that's non-negotiable from his side, but we'll have snipers with sight lines through the windows and tactical officers positioned to breach if necessary." Marcus absorbed this, the reality of the danger settling like a weight in his chest. "And what do I say to him? How do I talk him down?" "Keep him calm. Validate his feelings without validating his delusions. Try to get him to focus on the future, on his family, on reasons to walk out of there alive." Chen's expression softened slightly. "But Marcus, your priority is your own safety. If at any point you feel threatened, you give the signal and we extract you immediately." After further briefing and preparation, including being fitted with a bulletproof vest and communication device, Marcus found himself standing outside courtroom 3B, heart pounding but resolve firm. "Ready?" Chen asked quietly beside him. Marcus nodded, remembering suddenly, vividly, the feeling of handcuffs around his wrists 3 years earlier, the helplessness, the humiliation, the burning sense of injustice. Now he was walking voluntarily toward the man who had inflicted that experience, not seeking revenge but offering a chance at peaceful resolution. The symmetry was not lost on him. "I'm ready," he confirmed. Chen squeezed his shoulder briefly, then stepped back. "We're with you the whole time." Marcus took a deep breath and pushed open the courtroom door. The large room was dimly lit, emergency lights casting long shadows across the empty gallery. Officer Miller sat behind the judge's bench, a bizarre inversion of authority that might have seemed comical under different circumstances. His service weapon lay on the bench before him. "Officer Miller," Marcus called, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm here to talk." Miller looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to bitter satisfaction. "Georgetown, look at you now, bulletproof vest, police escort, big important investigator." "I'm just an intern," Marcus replied evenly, slowly moving further into the room. "And I'm here because you asked for me." Intern, Miller repeated with a harsh laugh. Right, just an intern who somehow managed to launch a full-scale investigation into a decorated officer. The investigation followed the evidence, Marcus said, repeating the mantra that had guided him throughout the process. It wasn't personal. Bullshit. Miller slammed his hand on the bench, causing Marcus to flinch. Had it out for me from the beginning. That night on Sheffield, you said you'd make me remember it differently. This was your plan all along. The accusation was so divorced from reality that Marcus momentarily struggled to respond. Officer Miller, I was 17 when we met. I had no power, no connections, no plan. I was just a kid trying to get home from the library. And now look at you, Miller continued as if he hadn't heard. Got the whole state attorney's office doing your bidding. Got Chen and the brass turning on their own. Even got Davidson questioning himself. His voice took on a conspiratorial edge. I figured it out, you know, how deep this goes. The whole system wanting to make examples of cops like me who actually do the job. Marcus recognized the paranoia Chen had described, the inability to distinguish between accountability and persecution. Still, he needed to establish some connection if he had any hope of de-escalating the situation. I understand you're angry, he said carefully. Anyone would be facing what you're facing, but this standoff isn't helping your case. Miller's laugh was hollow. My case? You think I'm worried about my case? There is no case, there's just the show they're going to put on to crucify me. He leaned forward. But I'm not going to make it easy for them. The implied threat sent a chill through Marcus. In his ear, the tactical officer whispered, keep him talking. Try to move away from the windows for a clearer shot if needed. Marcus deliberately took a step toward the center of the room, away from the windows. What do you want from this, Officer Miller? What's your best outcome tonight? The question seemed to momentarily break through Miller's agitation. Want, he repeated as if the concept was foreign. I want my life back. I want 20 years of service to mean something. I want people to know I was set up. No one set you up, Marcus said gently. The Rodriguez video, that wasn't fabricated. The complaints from Boyd, from Williams, from Jackson, those weren't conspiracies. They resisted, Miller insisted, voice rising again. Every one of them. You don't know what it's like out there, what we face every day. You sit in your courthouse office making judgments with your Georgetown education, but you've never had to make split-second decisions with your life on the line. There was a fundamental gulf between them, between Miller's perception of his actions as necessary policing and the objective reality documented in complaint after complaint. But Marcus recognized that this wasn't the moment to debate police tactics or use of force policies. You're right, he acknowledged, taking another careful step forward. I haven't walked in your shoes. I haven't faced the dangers you have. But I've been on the other side. I know what it feels like to be handcuffed when you've done nothing wrong, to be laughed at, to be humiliated. Miller's expression flickered with something like recognition. That night, you really were just walking home, weren't you? The question, the first acknowledgement of wrongdoing Marcus had ever heard from Miller, created a momentary opening. Yes, Marcus confirmed quietly. I was just walking home from the library. Preparing for a scholarship interview the next morning. Miller was silent for a long moment, something working behind his eyes, perhaps the first genuine reckoning with the human impact of his actions. So all this, he finally said, gesturing vaguely to encompass the investigation, the standoff, all of it, is because of that night, your revenge for being stopped. No, Marcus shook his head firmly. This isn't revenge. If it were about revenge, I wouldn't care about making the department better. I wouldn't care about proper procedures or evidence standards. I just want to see you suffer. He took another step closer, now within 20 feet of the bench. The investigation happened because there was evidence of misconduct. Multiple incidents, documented patterns. My personal history with you was disclosed and accounted for, but it wasn't the driving force. Miller seemed to deflate slightly, the righteous anger that had sustained him beginning to waver in the face of rational discussion. They're going to charge me, he said, a statement rather than a question. Criminal charges. Yes, Marcus confirmed, seeing no point in deception. But how this ends tonight will make a difference in how those charges are pursued. The tactical officer whispered again in Marcus's ear. Good. Keep focusing on positive outcomes. Remind him he has choices. Officer Miller Brendan, Marcus said, deliberately using the man's first name for the first time. You have options right now. This doesn't have to end badly. What options? Miller asked bitterly. Prison, disgrace, my kids seeing their father handcuffed on the news. You can walk out of here with dignity, Marcus suggested. Show your children that when you make mistakes, you take responsibility for them. That's a powerful lesson. Miller's hand moved closer to his weapon on the bench, causing Marcus's heart to skip a beat. In his ear, the tactical officer tensed. Movement toward the weapon. Be ready for extraction command. Easy for you to say, Miller replied, though the fight was gradually leaving his voice. You're just starting your life. Mine's over no matter what happens tonight. That's not true, Marcus insisted, taking another careful step forward, now just 15 feet from the bench. Whatever happens with the charges, whatever consequences come, your life isn't over. There's rehabilitation, there's redemption, there's a future beyond this moment. He paused, then added with quiet intensity, but only if you choose it, only if you put down that weapon and walk out of here with me. Something shifted in Miller's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, that he stood at a crossroads. That despite everything that had led to this moment, he still had agency in how his story would continue. Why do you care? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. After what I did to you, why would you be here trying to talk me down instead of letting them take the shot? The question cut to the heart of everything, the journey that had brought Marcus from that night on Sheffield Avenue to Georgetown to the Millfield courthouse, and finally to this moment of extraordinary reversal. Because this was never about you and me, Marcus answered with simple truth. It was about justice, and justice isn't the same as vengeance. A long silence stretched between them, the weight of choices, past and present, filling the courtroom. Finally, slowly, Miller pushed his weapon away from himself on the bench. I'm tired, he admitted, suddenly looking every day of his 40 years and more. Just tired of fighting. In Marcus's ear, the tactical officer relayed, weapon is clear of subject's reach. Maintain position. I understand, Marcus said gently, so let's end this fight at least. Whatever comes next, we'll face it according to the law, the same law we both believe in, even if we've seen different sides of it. Miller nodded almost imperceptibly. What happens when I walk out of there? You'll be taken into custody, Marcus told him honestly. There will be charges. But you'll also get counsel, due process, every protection the law provides, the same protections that should be afforded to everyone. The irony of the situation, Marcus Johnson assuring Officer Miller of his legal rights, was profound. 3 years earlier, their positions had been entirely reversed. Miller the authority figure, Marcus the powerless civilian subject to his discretion. Now, in this wood-paneled courtroom, the true meaning of justice was being enacted not through retribution, but through the careful application of law and the recognition of fundamental human dignity, even for someone who had denied that dignity to others. Okay, Miller finally said, rising slowly from behind the bench, hands visible. I'll come out. Thank you, Marcus said simply, genuine relief flooding through him. As they walked toward the courtroom doors together, Marcus slightly ahead, Miller following a few paces behind, the weight of the moment settled over both of them. This wasn't just the resolution of a standoff, but the culmination of a journey that had begun on Sheffield Avenue 3 years earlier. Just before they reached the doors, Miller spoke again, his voice quiet but clear in the empty courtroom. I'm sorry, he said, for that night, for laughing, for not seeing you, the real you. The words, so simple, so long awaited, caught Marcus off guard. He paused, turning back to meet Miller's gaze. Thank you, he said again, accepting the apology with the same dignity he had maintained throughout the investigation, throughout this extraordinary night. As they stepped through the courtroom doors, the tactical team moved swiftly to take Miller into custody, professionally, respectfully, without unnecessary force. The dramatic contrast to Marcus's own experience of being detained was not lost on anyone present. Sergeant Chen approached as Miller was being led away. You did it, she said quietly to Marcus. That was remarkable. Marcus watched as Miller was escorted to a waiting police vehicle, the officer's shoulders slumped but his head held up, facing whatever would come next. It wasn't about winning, Marcus told Chen. It was about changing things. And in that moment, standing in the courthouse where he would one day preside as Judge Marcus Johnson, he knew that change had indeed begun, not just for the Millfield Police Department, but for everyone involved in this complex, difficult, necessary reckoning. Part 7. Resolution 15 years later, Judge Marcus Johnson adjusted his robes as he prepared to enter courtroom 3B of the Millfield County Courthouse. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges ever appointed to the Superior Court bench, his rise through the legal profession as meteoric as it had been purposeful. After graduating from Georgetown with highest honors, he had attended Yale Law School, clerked for a federal judge, and served as an assistant state attorney before being nominated to the judiciary. A path marked by both excellence and an unwavering commitment to reforming the systems he had once been victimized by. All rise, the bailiff called as Marcus entered the courtroom. The Superior Court for the County of Millfield is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marcus Johnson presiding. Marcus took his seat at the bench, the same bench where 15 years earlier, Officer Brendan Miller had sat during their midnight confrontation. The symmetry was not lost on him, though he suspected few in the courtroom knew that particular chapter of history. "Good morning," he greeted the assembled attorneys and observers. "We have several matters on the docket today, but first, I believe we have new counsel to admit to the bar." The court clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, we have 3 new attorneys to be sworn in." Marcus smiled. This was always one of his favorite duties, welcoming new lawyers into the profession, particularly those from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in the legal system. As the clerk called the names, the 3 recent law school graduates approached the bench. A young Latina woman, a South Asian man, and an African-American woman, all looking both nervous and proud as they prepared to take their professional oaths. "Before we proceed with the formal swearing-in," Marcus addressed them, "I'd like to share a brief thought about the responsibility you're about to undertake." The new attorneys listened attentively, unaware of the personal history that informed their judge's perspective. "The law is powerful," Marcus continued, "but it is also imperfect. As attorneys, you'll work within a system that sometimes falls short of its highest ideals. You'll see injustice even as you strive to deliver justice. You'll encounter resistance to necessary change." He paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "But the law is also evolving, adapting, growing toward its better self, and you are now part of that evolution. Every case you handle, every client you represent, every reform you advocate for shapes the system. Never forget that." The young attorneys nodded solemnly, perhaps sensing the depth of conviction behind his words. After administering their oaths and congratulating each new member of the bar, Marcus proceeded with the regular docket. It was a typical Monday morning calendar arraignments, scheduling conferences, plea hearings, the routine but essential business of the court. Mid-morning, a case was called that caused a subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere. State versus Thompson, case number CR 234501. The defendant, a young black man no older than 20, was led in by court officers. His public defender stood beside him, while Assistant State Attorney James Wilson, once Officer Wilson, who had trained under Sergeant Chen all those years ago, represented the prosecution. "Mr. Wilson," Marcus acknowledged the prosecutor. "This is a first appearance on charges of resisting arrest and possession of marijuana, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Wilson confirmed. "The state alleges that the defendant physically resisted officers during a lawful stop and was found in possession of a controlled substance." Marcus turned to the defense table. "And how does your client plead, counselor?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," the public defender replied, "and we're requesting release on personal recognizance. Mr. Thompson has no prior record, is employed full-time, and has strong community ties." Marcus reviewed the file before him, noting details that echoed across time. A young man stopped while walking through Westwood at night, an interaction that escalated, allegations of resistance that seemed inconsistent with the defendant's lack of prior contacts with law enforcement. "Mr. Wilson, I see the arresting officer was Sergeant Paul Davidson." "Yes, Your Honor," Wilson confirmed, a flicker of recognition crossing his features at the significance of the name. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And I understand there is body camera footage of this incident?" "There is, Judge," Wilson confirmed. "The state would be prepared to provide that during discovery." "I'd like to review that footage before we proceed further," Marcus decided. "This case raises questions that I believe warrant careful examination." The public defender straightened, suddenly more attentive. It was unusual for a judge to request body camera footage at an initial appearance. "In the meantime," Marcus continued, "I'm granting release on personal recognizance. Mr. Thompson, you are to return for our next hearing date and remain in contact with your attorney." The young man nodded, visible relief crossing his features. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the case concluded and the next was called, Marcus made a mental note to speak with Chief of Police Diane Chen about this incident. Over the 15 years since the Miller investigation, the Millfield Police Department had undergone significant transformation under Chen's leadership, implementing comprehensive reforms, diversifying its ranks, and building meaningful community relationships. But progress was never a straight line, and vigilance remained essential. The Thompson case suggested that even after all this time, some patterns persisted. After court adjourned for the lunch recess, Marcus was surprised to find Assistant State Attorney Wilson waiting outside his chambers. "Judge Johnson," Wilson greeted him formally. "May I have a moment of your time?" Marcus nodded, inviting the prosecutor into his office. Once the door closed, the professional formality between them softened slightly. They had known each other for many years, their careers intersecting at various points since Wilson had traded his badge for a law degree in the aftermath of the Miller investigation. "It's about the Thompson case," Wilson began without preamble. "I wanted you to know I've already requested a full review. The body cam footage, it's concerning, reminded me of another case from years ago." Marcus understood the reference immediately. "Davidson was your training officer once, wasn't he?" Wilson nodded. "He was. After the Miller incident, he seemed to change, became an advocate for reform within the department, actually. But he's close to retirement now, feeling pressure from younger officers about being soft, and I'm concerned he's reverting to old patterns." The complexity of institutional change, its advances and retreats, its personal and systemic dimensions was something both men understood intimately. "Thank you for your candor," Marcus said. "I'll review the footage objectively, of course." "I know you will," Wilson assured him. "That's why I wanted to speak with you directly, because you more than anyone understand that accountability isn't about punishing individuals, it's about preserving the integrity of the system." After Wilson left, Marcus sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The path from that night on Sheffield Avenue to the judge's bench had not been linear or simple. It had involved difficult choices, complex ethical considerations, and the constant challenge of balancing personal experience with professional objectivity. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. "Lunch with Mrs. A tomorrow. She's insisting on making your favorite cookies." Marcus smiled. Clara Abernathy, now in her late 80s but still sharp as ever, remained a constant in his life, a witness to his journey and a reminder of the community that had shaped him. "Absolutely asterisk," he texted back. "Tell her I can't wait." Later that afternoon, after reviewing several pending motions in his chambers, Marcus was interrupted by his judicial assistant. "Judge, you have a visitor who doesn't have an appointment," she informed him. "Normally I'd reschedule, but it's Brendan Miller." The name sent a jolt of surprise through Marcus. Though he had occasionally crossed paths with the former officer over the years, they had not had a substantive conversation since that night in the courtroom. "Send him in," Marcus decided after a moment's consideration. Brendan Miller entered the chambers, the years evident in his gray hair and the lines etched around his eyes. At 55, he carried himself with a different kind of dignity than the aggressive confidence he had once projected as an officer more measured, more thoughtful. "Judge Johnson," Miller greeted him with a respectful nod. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Mr. Miller," Marcus acknowledged, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What brings you to the courthouse today?" Miller took a seat, seeming to gather his thoughts before speaking. "I heard about the Thompson case about Davidson. Word still gets around to us old-timers." After his arrest 15 years earlier, Miller had ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges, serving 18 months in prison followed by probation. Upon release, he had undergone rehabilitation, pursued education in social work, and eventually established a program working with troubled youth in Westwood, a remarkable transformation that few would have predicted during his darkest moments. "I see," Marcus said carefully, maintaining professional boundaries despite their unique history. "I can't discuss pending cases, of course." "I understand," Miller nodded. "I'm not here about the specifics. I'm here because I've been where Davidson is now, that place where you've convinced yourself that slipping back into old habits is justified, where you start to forget the lessons that were so clear once." Marcus listened, struck by the insight Miller had developed into his own past behavior. "I mentor young people now," Miller continued. "Kids from Westwood mostly, try to help them navigate interactions with authority, understand their rights, build different relationships with the system than I had with them at their age." He paused. "I tell them about you sometimes, about what you taught me that night in this courthouse." "What did I teach you?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Miller met his gaze directly. "That justice isn't about power, it's about restoration. About making things right, not just making someone pay." The evolution in Miller's thinking, from the officer who had laughed while handcuffing a 17-year-old to the man sitting before him now, was perhaps the most profound testament to the possibility of change. "Davidson's a good man at heart," Miller continued. "But he's losing his way. I thought maybe I could talk to him, officer to officer, about what's on the other side of accountability." Marcus considered this carefully. There was no legal impediment to Miller speaking with Davidson, and the potential benefit was significant. Someone who had walked the same path offering perspective that might prevent another officer from continuing down a destructive road. "I think that would be valuable," Marcus agreed. Though, of course, it would be Davidson's choice whether to have that conversation. Miller nodded. Of course, I just wanted to, I don't know, make sure it wouldn't complicate things for your court. It wouldn't, Marcus assured him. The legal process will proceed based on evidence and law, regardless of any personal conversations. As their meeting concluded and Miller rose to leave, he paused at the door. You know, when I was at my lowest in that cell, everyone against me, career over, family disappointed, I couldn't understand why you of all people had tried to talk me down that night. Why you'd risk your life to give me a chance I didn't deserve. Marcus remained silent, allowing Miller the space to complete his thought. I think I understand now, Miller continued. You weren't just saving my life, you were saving what I could become, what I might still contribute. He gestured vaguely toward the courthouse beyond the chambers. Just like what you do every day from that bench. After Miller departed, Marcus sat motionless for several minutes, absorbing the unexpected encounter and its significance. The full-circle nature of their intertwined journeys was profound. From that night on Sheffield Avenue, through the investigation and standoff, to their current roles as judge and youth mentor. Later that week, Marcus attended a community forum in Westwood, one of the regular events he participated in as part of his commitment to making the legal system more accessible and transparent to the communities it served. The meeting was held at the Westwood Community Center, where 15 years earlier, a young Marcus had tutored neighborhood kids while preparing for his own departure to Georgetown. Now, as a judge, he returned to answer questions, listen to concerns, and bridge the gap between the courthouse and the community. Judge Johnson, a young woman addressed him during the question period, do you think things have really changed? I mean, we still see police harassment in our neighborhood. We still see disparities in who gets arrested versus who gets warnings. The faces change, but the system seems the same. The directness of the question reflected the healthy skepticism many in Westwood maintained toward institutions that had historically failed them, a skepticism Marcus himself had once shared. That's an important question, he acknowledged. And the honest answer is complicated. Have things changed completely? No. The work of reform is never finished. We still see disparities, still confront biases, still struggle with systems that were designed without all voices at the table. He paused, looking around the room at elderly residents who remembered the old days, at parents raising children in a changing neighborhood, at young people trying to envision their futures. But have things changed meaningfully? Yes. 15 years ago, there was no civilian review board, no body cameras, no diversity in department leadership. No forums like this where a judge would be expected to answer directly to the community. The young woman nodded, acknowledging these points while her expression suggested she remained only partially convinced. The most important change, Marcus continued, is that now there's a pathway for accountability. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but real. When systems fail, as they sometimes still do, there are mechanisms to address those failures. And people within the systems, police officers, prosecutors, judges, who are committed to making them work better. He leaned forward slightly. The question isn't whether things have changed enough. They haven't. The question is whether we'll keep pushing for the changes still needed. And that's where your voice, your vigilance, your participation matters most. After the forum concluded, Marcus found himself approached by a familiar figure, Sergeant James Wilson, now retired from the Millfield Police Department and serving as a community liaison for the Civilian Review Board. Good answer about change, Wilson commented. Honest without being dismissive or defensive. Marcus smiled. Thanks, it's a balance acknowledging progress without suggesting the work is done. They walked together toward the parking lot, discussing recent developments in police-community relations and the upcoming review board hearing on a controversial use of force case. By the way, Wilson mentioned casually, Miller spoke with Davidson yesterday. Had quite an impact, apparently. Davidson's requested a temporary reassignment to desk duty while he completes some additional training. The news was encouraging, a small but significant example of how individual choices could interrupt patterns before they became crises. That's good to hear, Marcus said. Sometimes the most effective interventions happen outside the courtroom. Speaking of which, Wilson continued, Chief Chen wanted me to remind you about the youth court program starting next month. She's hoping you'll speak at the orientation. The Youth Court Initiative, a diversion program that allowed teenage offenders to be judged by their peers under the mentorship of legal professionals, was one of many innovations that had emerged from the reforms following the Miller investigation. Marcus had been an early advocate for the program, seeing in it both educational value and restorative potential. "I'd be happy to," he agreed. As he drove home that evening, Marcus reflected on the intricate web of relationships, events, and decisions that had transformed not just his own life, but the institutions that shaped his community. The 17-year-old walking home from the library could never have imagined that his humiliation at the hands of officers Miller and Davidson would ultimately catalyze his dedication to reforming the very systems that had failed him. The next morning, as Marcus prepared to take the bench for another day of cases, he received a message from his clerk. The Thompson case had been resolved. After reviewing the body camera footage, Sergeant Davidson had acknowledged procedural violations, and the prosecutor had moved to dismiss the charges. More significantly, Davidson had personally apologized to Thompson and requested to participate in the department's Community Reconciliation Program, a structured process for addressing harms caused by police actions, developed in partnership with community leaders after the reforms. It wasn't a perfect resolution. True justice would have meant the stop never occurred in the first place, but it represented something profound. Accountability without destruction, recognition without retribution, the possibility of growth from failure. As Marcus donned his judicial robe and prepared to enter courtroom 3B, he thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this place. From the 17-year-old in handcuffs to the Georgetown student to the intern investigating police misconduct to the judge administering justice, each phase had built upon the last. Each challenge had strengthened his commitment. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Superior Court for the County of Millfield is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marcus Johnson presiding." Marcus took his place behind the bench, surveying the courtroom with the quiet dignity that had become his hallmark. Before him sat attorneys and defendants, victims and witnesses, community members and court personnel, all participants in the complex, imperfect, essential project of justice. "Good morning," he greeted them. "Let's begin." In that moment, 15 years after officers Miller and Davidson had laughed while placing handcuffs on a terrified teenager, Judge Marcus Johnson embodied something more powerful than revenge, more lasting than retribution. He represented the transformative power of justice pursued with integrity, of systems reformed through persistent effort, of the extraordinary potential that emerges when people choose to change rather than simply punish. And as he called the first case of the day, his words from that fateful night echoed across time. "This was never about you and me. It was about justice, and justice isn't the same as vengeance." In courtroom 3B of the Millfield County Courthouse, that distinction made all the difference in the world. If you've been moved by this story, please consider subscribing to At Precipha Stories for more narratives that explore moral complexity, human transformation, and the power of justice that restores rather than merely punishes. Would you have found the strength to seek systemic change rather than personal revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters to our community of thoughtful viewers. Remember that real change, like Marcus discovered, often comes not through dramatic confrontations, but through persistent commitment to improving the systems that shape our lives. What small step could you take today toward positive change in your own community?